Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Farming Focus, the podcast for South West farmers, proudly brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I'm your host, Peter Green, and today we're talking about agroforestry and its potential for farming businesses in the South West and further afield. I'm joined by two guests. Tom Kemp is Director and Head of Forestry at Working Woodlands Cornwall. He's been involved with woodland management for the last 15 years, and he actively manages a number of woods and woodland creation projects in Cornwall. He's also the lead farmer and agroforester for Four Legs Good, an 8-acre agroforestry-led pig farm in its early stages. Sir Harry Studholme is a forester and farmer in Devon, based at the Perridge Estate near Exeter. He's an Honorary Fellow of the Institute of Chartered Foresters and an Honorary Professor at the University of Exeter. Between January 2013 and February 2020, he was chairman of the Forestry Commission and is vastly experienced on all things agriculture and business, and particularly in the Southwest. So I am really looking forward to today's conversation. Harry, Tom, a very warm welcome to you both.
Hi, Peter. Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
Wonderful to have you. So, Tom, I'll start with you, if I may. Can you just introduce yourself and give us a bit more background, please, on you and what you do?
Yeah, so I've been involved in forestry since I was sort of 13. 9 years ago, set up Working Woodlands Cornwall, sort of grown out of earlier projects, which was primarily focused at sort of restoring ancient woodland that is sort of typically tricky to manage and is neglected. But there's always been a link with farm woodland as well. In Cornwall, especially, a big sort of stakeholder in woodland ownership are farmers. And often it's sort of the area of the farm that is the least visited, the least intensively managed. And so as sort of the concept and sort of the idea of agroforestry in farming in Cornwall has become sort of, it's really been gathering pace over the last few years. It's sort of been a natural progression for our business. With my other hat on, I work in the estate woodland, and part of that was we had some scrubland cleared, and that was very expensive just to clear the scrub. So we decided to use pigs for clearing the next bit. And that was pretty successful, and that sort of led me down a pigs, a trees and pasture route with Four Legs Good.
Harry, as I alluded to in the introduction, you have worn many hats in your career. Could you just tell us a bit more about your experience in forestry and farming particularly, please?
Well, I think critically in this area, in Devon, I've managed a productive forest for the last 35 years and alongside it a farm. And I've for a long time been interested in the interaction between the two of them, and over the last few years, I've used I've grazed a wood as a green barn, and also planted walnuts a few years ago. I think what I've done in the past has been what I thought was just normal forestry and farming, but I think this new word, agroforestry, has rather crept up the rails.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So when I was thinking about this podcast and planning for it, I was sort of wondering, where did that confluence come from? Is it just an ease thing? Because really, I guess, Harry, what we're looking at is forestry on farms and in a farming context. Is that fair?
I think it probably is. I think we've got to take a lot of care in this area because agroforestry is a political word. It covers an awful lot of things, from what essentially one might have thought of as orcharding with nuts and with fruit, to actually trees in pasture, and then features of farmland like hedges and trees, roadside trees. So it's kind of rebadging quite a lot of existing stuff, partly for political convenience, partly maybe because it's helpful for the way people see it. And at the same time, there's been a huge void, both in government policy being stuck with what's happened as a result of Brexit, and also in farmers' mind. I mean, farming is not going through an easy time by and large. There are lots of problems with farming, and people are looking at new ways and new ideas. And then on the side of it, there's a whole lot of NGOs and things that have agendas to plug. And this is a word that conveniently plugs into the non-farming and the non-forestry vocabulary. And I think it's gained momentum from there. It's not to say it's not a useful word for a whole group of people, but it has been an interesting change.
So some really great thoughts there on the term agroforestry from Harry. Tom, what's your take on the term? Can you give us what you would understand as a simple explanation for anyone who's listening and maybe doesn't know what we're talking about at all?
Yeah, I mean, it is really, really broad word, and definitions change person to person. My personal definition is sort of just using trees for farming, basically. There's been like an erosion of literal trees in farmed landscapes, but also an erosion of sort of knowledge about how to use trees. As sort of people have specialized, farmers are less used to going and getting their fencing stakes from their wood, but they're used to going and getting them from a feed store. We've gradually been siloed off into our particular specialisms. And so it's sort of that reintegration, I guess, of trees and farming, really.
Great. Okay. So, Harry, a moment ago, you talked about a bit of a void, particularly around policy. But from your perspective, what other reasons are there that you think that agroforestry is maybe gaining more interest among farming and the broader agriculture industry at the moment?
I think there are some things that are genuinely interesting. For livestock, I think there are, particularly with climate change, there are issues around shade and shelter, which will improve productivity. And some of the creatures it's very effective in, for instance, with chickens, which are basically woodland birds. Pigs like woods. For a lot of history, going back to the Middle Ages, woods were where you put your pigs. And so some of those things are a rediscovery of things that are, absolutely natural things. I think there's a problem that some people have imported tropical agricultural activities, where the problem is for growing stuff is very often, as is on the arable side, growing is actually trying to get shade. If you're trying to grow coffee or whatever, some of these crops need shade. Actually, we need sunshine. We're desperate for sunshine. So there are some misunderstandings going on. I think what really interests me, which you haven't mentioned, and one of the things in Perridge which really matters, is for an ecological point of view, the relationship between trees and farmland is really important. Birds nest in trees, but may well be looking for, worms or seeds in a farmed landscape. So that interface between forest and farm has probably been undervalued from an ecological point of view. From a farmland point of view, I think farmers are probably better informed than one thinks, but they don't like venturing into areas which are uncomfortable. But forestry, I have seen very few, apart from the nuts and the fruit, there's very few of these ventures where really the forestry itself is providing any economic value at all. It's a byproduct of using trees.
Great. So, Tom, I saw you nodding there. What are your thoughts on what Harry's just said?
Oh, there was quite a lot there, and
just a bit.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. Harry was talking about how a lot of it is rediscovering former uses for woodland, and things like using woodland as a place to put livestock in the past has been done sort of as a thing that's always been done, or like a process that is sort of not really deeply considered. Whereas the exciting thing about agroforestry research for me now is that there's loads of really good, robust evidence on how we can use trees really effectively. So an example would be like the leaves of mulberry. We can grow mulberries quite well here, and they have fruits that sort of help build into the ecosystem elements that Harry was talking about. But the leaves of mulberry are around 22% protein. You can feed them to livestock, and it's sort of comparable with lucerne, alfalfa. And on top of that, there's loads of micronutrients within there. And then other little interesting things like the fact that if you have livestock, especially cattle, in a treed landscape, the rates of farmer injuries from their cattle really drop dramatically because the animals are happier. And if they're happier, they're probably going to be converting more of their grass into meat rather than stressing it out. And it's really about the whole, improving the sort of health and functioning of the whole system. And farms and farmers are really good at looking at systems and thinking about their farms as systems. But what we're seeing now is sort of the ecology of a farm is really key to the economics of a farm, I think. And Gabe Brown, the American regen farmer, says it's not a problem with fertility, it's a problem with biodiversity, essentially. And once you get those ecosystems functioning again, a lot of the problems and difficult areas of farming start to become less extreme.
Yeah, it feels to me that farming over the last few decades and perhaps generations has gone down a path of needing to focus, needing to concentrate, needing to specialize, because we need to get these economies of scale, and we need to produce, we are encouraged to produce more effectively and efficiency, better for less. But actually in doing so, we've moved away from that systems thinking, which, as you said, farmers are really good at doing. We're good at working in a holistic way and looking in a holistic way. Farmers dwell outside most of the time in the center of nature, and actually it's something that I think there's been a move away from, and this increased awareness of agroforestry as a different way of doing things feels like something which is a reconnection with that.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Harry, at a larger estate level like Perridge, have you incorporated trees and farming together? You touched there a bit on the fact that you've used trees as a green barn of sorts, but presumably there are elements of the estate where the forestry is separate from the farming, and are there aspects where it's closer together?
I think in my head it's a single unit, but
Right.
Actually, farming and forestry, and one of the difficulties with agroforestry is the emphasis is on the agro. So from a point of view of a forester, I don't think people are thinking very much about it. So the forestry operates on a much longer time scale. I'm thinking the decisions I'm taking in forestry, I'm taking 100-year or more decisions in what I'm planting, what I'm managing, what I'm looking for, and I'm taking a surplus of what is a perennial cover. And so farming's a very different timescale. Currently it's an annual one. One of the things that I think is interesting about potentially about agroforestry is looking more at perennial cropping, which may become more important with climate change. So, for instance, the planting of the walnuts is really exploring perennial cropping issues. So, being able to take things off something that's in the landscape all the time on a year-by-year basis. It goes up and down, but you haven't got this massive risk of establishment every year as a farmer. The interaction between the green barn stuff, the consequence of the green barn, in fact, was a result of a failed plantation. And one of the difficulties we've all got, and I think that's true of agroforestry as a farmer, is the people who are telling you to do stuff very often have completely different agendas to your own. So I shoved in what was thought to be very good, planting up some native trees or, broadleaf woodland. And they got hammered by the squirrels. They really haven't done particularly well. And in fact, a green barn is a good use for low quality woodland that's never going to come to anything from a forestry point of view.
Yeah. So what you've done there again is sort of take that holistic view. It's to step back, to look at your context, and then to understand as well, a more detailed plan for what can work in that place. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. I think what's true of anybody who's farming or running a forest is you need to understand your land as well as you can. You need to understand your markets. You need to understand what are your realistic opportunities. And the reason why we are more forested than most places in Devon is we're steep. We're steep, difficult, awkward land. And I planted up quite a lot in the late 1990s. And my reason was I was concerned for health and safety for tractor driving on the steep land. And that's particularly true of trees too. Certain trees will thrive in different places. I plant different things where there are deep soils in the valleys to exposed places on the ridges. And farmers know incredibly well what their good pieces of land are, what they can manage. And quite a lot of the agroforestry projects, again, I'm not sure about the word agroforestry, but it can plant up corners of fields where you're not really losing much productivity, but you could gain other aspects like shade in terms of livestock, or some environmental values.
Yeah. So understand your land. I mean, that's a really pithy quote, but there's so much in that. And so that's just really about knowing the context. So what works where, your soil type, drainage, runoff, slope. It's all of these sorts of things, and sort of building up that picture of what can work in different places. At the beginning of that previous answer, you talked about the 100-year timelines. Now, I'm fascinated by this. I was fortunate enough recently to be in New Zealand, and a lot of the Maori that own land out there, they are working on 100-year plus timelines. And for a farmer and accountant from the UK, to me, that was just mind blowing to understand how one can think on a timescale that exceeds my own lifetime. Did that require much change from you, or is that something that you'd always done, your family had always done? And I guess also, how do you dovetail that with the farming timelines that you talked about, which are that much shorter?
Well, from a forestry point of view, you don't really have much option. And looking at the climate change projections track the top line of the IPCC projections. And there are good reasons for that, which is governments. The IPCC projections are approved by governments who do not want pessimistic projections. If you are planning to be around, and my family have been looking after this land for well over 100 years, you need to be thinking about what might happen on that timescale. And when you plant a tree, particularly if you plant a broadleaf tree, it's not going to be mature, inside that timeline. In fact, the conifers that I'm planting are also not going to be truly mature inside that timeline. So we have to think in those terms. It's not really an option. It's not hard to get your head round, but it's hard to get your head round in a context where government policy is looking at a relatively short-term timescale, and NGOs particularly are looking very much backwards in terms of what they're talking about for forestry.
Tom, we've talked there a little bit about some of the conflicts between how we need to plan as foresters, farmers, agroforesters, and the context that we're sitting in. But can you talk a little bit about what influences the way you plan? I guess I'm thinking here about the impact on soil health, biodiversity, animal welfare when you're looking at planning a new woodland.
Well, Harry mentioned a key point there is when he was talking about planting trees on steep land so that tractor drivers can avoid rolling the tractor. Whenever we're sort of consulting on agroforestry design, we always say sort of look at the areas of your system that are sort of either the problem areas or the areas that are sort of the things that you want to sort of tackle, because quite often trees are an answer for that. And that's Harry's example is quite a tangible one. Some people might think about fencing that, and that area of land is it's a dead zone, really. Suddenly you involve trees, and potentially that land can be making some money or solving some problems with shade or shelter. But yeah, trees really tick loads and loads of boxes. So it's hard to reel out the list of the things those trees are going to be doing without the list being quite long. But yeah, the sort of things that I'm trying to solve on the estate where I sort of manage the agroforestry, trying to tackle things like it's really exposed land here. So we have great southwesterly storms in winter. In summertime, it's baking hot. The soils are relatively shallow. So we're trying to sort of temper the extremes of weather, basically.
Great. So you talked there about planting with the climate, so understanding what the climate's going to be and what trees will work best there. But how do you plant with a view on the future and how the climate's going to change? I mean, we are experiencing drier summers, we're experiencing wetter winters. How do we mitigate those risks? Tom, I'll come to you first, and then Harry, if I might get your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, that's always a tricky one. But the answer really is quite simple, and that's just ensuring that you plant a diversity of species so that all your eggs aren't in one basket. We don't really know what is going to happen. There's some suggestions of how the climate might be, but there's uncertainty as well about a lot of species that might be suitable or might not be suitable. And so the key really is to plant a diverse range of species and also try and manage in a sort of diversity of ways. So we've seen the problems of planting monocultures in forestry really clearly, possibly in agriculture less so. But yeah, there's been some huge problems. Things like Sitka spruce in the southeast. Now we have a beetle called Ips that is tearing its way through spruce. And so in forestry, as Harry said, the timescale is really long. So when a problem like a tree disease comes along, that's 100 years of work gone out the window. So we learn these lessons quite, they stick with us, hopefully. And diversity is key.
Yeah. So, Harry, how are you, I guess, mitigating for potential climate change on the Perridge Estate?
Well, I think it's all partly thinking on a range of timescales, and we've got things that were planted a long time ago. So I've got stuff that were planting 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago. And so it's carrying on that tradition of sort of carrying on planting. I totally agree with Tom about diversity, and I'm interested really by his talking about mulberry, because getting very hung up on native species is a real problem in agroforestry, because I mean, in fact, interestingly, one shouldn't be hung up on it, because Cornwall was at doomsday was only 3% forest cover. Devon was 4% forest cover. So everywhere we're planting, by and large, has not had trees on it for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're not, and the climates that we're going into are climates that we haven't had potentially for very long periods of time indeed. A minimum of where we are now, maybe moving towards somewhere where we were 120,000 years ago. We may go through that into places where we were 1 million years ago. And so we really shouldn't get hung up that the landscapes of the future are going to be the same as they were in an imagined past. So things like mulberry are interesting. I haven't personally planted mulberry. It's not a good timber, so I'm not very for it on a forest point of view. But the key is diversity. I mean, things like chestnut are interesting. It's a non-native tree, possibly introduced by the Romans, good for fence posts. But it's not just that. There are, I just keep planting and keep experimenting, and I keep looking at trees that are not on our current list of thinking, because I think our climate potentially may move. And Tom was talking about uncertainty. Disease is a huge problem. I mean, we've lost, we're losing ash at the moment, and we've already lost elm in really relatively recent history.
We need to draw it to a close. So if we dream the dream, where can agroforestry go over the next sort of 10, 20 years in the Southwest? And what needs to happen to achieve some of these goals?
It's simple, really. Just seeing farmers think about trees as a useful element of their farm rather than something that you've got to flail once or twice a year. It would be really interesting and totally feasible just to change the sort of narrative, change the story about trees and get farmers excited. And if we had sort of 1% more trees on farms, that would be quite a big change in the landscape and quite a big change in the way of thinking. And I think farms and farmers would see the benefit of that.
So, Harry, a similar question to you. What ambitions can we have for woodland and perhaps increased integration of forestry into agriculture over the next generation or longer in the Southwest? And what needs to happen to achieve that?
I think one of the challenges are things like these words, ambition and the big things, because I think there is a faint feeling that and it is true that a lot of it's kind of woo-woo, and some are on the edge of it, and the organizations that are promoting it have their own agendas. I think what matters for farming is that it becomes a day-to-day issue, that you plant the right, you try to plant up corners that are dangerous, or for instance, my walnut plantations is on places which get bad wash runoff, soil erosion. There are places where it's actually not a sort of a dramatic change. It's where it's just a sensible use of land. So I think the best thing for agroforestry is for it to start to become a mundane part of everyday farming rather than a kind of, a sort of a separate. It's just part of sensible farm management.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, Tom, with those words echoing in our ears about making woodland and forestry on farm just a part of what we're doing day to day, it doesn't have to be dramatic. For farmers listening who might be interested but just not sure where to start, what would the advice be?
My main advice would be to reach out to other farmers, ideally local ones to you, who are starting to go down this route. And farmers are good networkers on the whole. There's a good network of farmers. The next step would be to reach out to organisations that might help you along with this. Although, as Harry alluded to earlier on, depending on the organisation, everyone's got their agendas. But there's some really good sort of member-led one. I do a lot of stuff with the Land Workers Alliance, and our agroforestry group is really robust, and there's some amazing knowledge pinging around. The power of a WhatsApp group is quite incredible, really. And suddenly there is the knowledge of almost thousands of years of people's experience right at your fingertips. So it'd be talking to people who have gone down different routes, learning what's worked, learning what hasn't.
Yeah. Okay. So just canvass different opinions, be prepared to have an open mind, look at what people have done, preferably in a similar context to your own, and just ask those questions and listen well to the answers.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your thoughts and your expertise on today's episode. It's been a real privilege. So thank you very much, Harry Studholme and Tom Kemp.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
It's time now for this week's showstoppers. I think the first thing that really has stuck with me from this conversation with Harry and Tom is that we shouldn't get hung up on the term agroforestry. What we're talking about is the inclusion of trees in and on our farms, and we're thinking about what they can offer. The second thing is that we really need to understand the detail. We need to understand your land, as Harry put it. We need to be thinking about our farm as a system in a holistic way. We need to be thinking about the context, so understanding soil types, slope, runoff, water, how it moves, hydrology, if you like, the weather patterns that we get and may get in the future. And in terms of the detail, we need to be thinking about what we want to achieve. We spoke there right at the end about being purposeful and about intentional. This is not about just planting a load of trees and seeing what happens, although that's really important to listen to the trees. This is about planting trees and understanding what we want to achieve and where on our farms. But the third piece that's really stuck with me, and this is something which I'm really interested in, is the mindset. And it needs to be pretty different, actually, I think, from what we're doing on farms day in, day out. Harry talked about how he's looking at a 100-year window when he's planning his woodland and his forestry. And I think it's easy for farmers to think that we're thinking quite long term. Our production cycles are generally over a year. And in today's really fast-paced world, that is different. But actually, I think there's a challenge in here for all of us, and I'm including myself in this as a farmer, that what we need to be thinking about is a much longer horizon. We need to be thinking about the horizon of our farm, of our business, of our soil for over 25, over 50 years, maybe even 100 years, like the Maori that I saw in New Zealand. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's definitely something that we need to try and do, I think.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.
Join us next week for a bonus episode when we'll be exploring which tree species to use on your farm. We'd love to hear from you with any feedback you have about the podcast or questions and suggestions. Send us an email to podcast@cornishmutual.co.uk. Check out the show notes for more information on today's episode, including the link to our podcast disclaimer. You've been listening to Farming Focus, brought to you by Cornish Mutual. I've been Peter Green, and until next time, it's goodbye from me and everyone in the Cornish Mutual podcast team.
Cornish Mutual, farming insurance experts.